In the history of World War II, few tales of single-handed combat can match what Lieutenant John George accomplished on Guadalcanal. In just 4 days, he used a hunting rifle to eliminate the 11-man sniper cell that had been paralyzing his battalion. If you want more untold stories of military history and heroism, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. His fellow officers had called his Winchester Model 70 a toy and his scope a mail-order sweetheart. On January 22, 1943, with 14 American soldiers dead in 72 hours, his commander gave him one morning to prove his bolt-action rifle was more than a joke. What happened over the next 4 days would change how the American military thought about snipers forever. But first, we need to understand just how badly George had to fight to even get that rifle to the Pacific. January 22nd, 1943. A 27-year-old lieutenant crouches in the ruins of a Japanese bunker on Guadalcanal, watching a banyan tree 240 yards away through a rifle scope his fellow officers had been mocking for 6 weeks straight. His commanding officer called it a toy. Other platoon leaders called it his mail-order sweetheart. The rifle in question? A Winchester Model 70 sporting rifle he'd bought with 2 years of National Guard pay. While every other man in his battalion carried a standard-issue M1 Garand, John George had a bolt-action hunting rifle with a civilian scope. And in the groves west of Point Cruz, 11 Japanese snipers were systematically killing American soldiers. 14 men dead in 72 hours. The battalion commander gave George one morning to prove his mail-order rifle could actually hit something. What happened over the next 4 days would change how the American military thought about snipers forever. But first, we need to understand just how badly George had to fight to even get that rifle to the Pacific. When George unpacked his Winchester at Camp Forest, Tennessee, the armorer wanted to know if it was meant for deer or Germans. George told him it was for the Japanese. Then the unit shipped out before the rifle arrived. George spent the entire voyage to Guadalcanal watching other men clean their Garands while his own weapons sat in a warehouse back in Illinois. He had to request it be forwarded through military mail. 6 weeks later, in late December 1942, a supply sergeant handed him a wooden crate marked Fragile. Inside was the rifle he'd been waiting for. The Winchester weighed 9 pounds. The Lyman Alaskan scope added another 12 ounces. Compare that to the Garand at 9.5 pounds with no magnification whatsoever. George's rifle was bolt action, 5 rounds. The Garand, semi-automatic, 8 rounds. On paper, George had brought an inferior weapon to a modern war. Captain Morris didn't just suggest George leave the sporting rifle in his tent. He ordered it. George carried it anyway. There's a particular kind of confidence that comes from being an Illinois state champion at 1,000 yards. George had won that title in 1939 at age 23, youngest winner in the state's history. He could put 6 rounds into a 6-inch group at 600 yards with iron sights alone. With the Lyman Alaskan scope, he could place 5 rounds inside 4 inches at 300 yards. But none of that mattered to the men who'd been fighting since August. The 132nd Infantry had relieved the Marines on Guadalcanal in late December. The Marines had taken Henderson Field and held it, but they hadn't taken Mount Austin, and they hadn't cleared the Japanese from the coastal groves west of the Matanikau River. Mount Austin stood 1,514 feet tall. The Japanese called it the Gifu. 500 men in 47 bunkers. George's battalion attacked on December 17th and fought for 16 straight days. They lost 34 men killed and 279 wounded before they finally took the western slope on January 2nd, 1943. In all that time, George fired his Winchester exactly 0 times in combat. The jungle around Point Cruz turned out to be different. No bunkers, no fixed positions, just Japanese soldiers who'd retreated west from Henderson Field and dug into massive trees. Some of those soldiers were snipers with scoped Arisaka Type 98 rifles. They knew the jungle. They knew how to wait. On January 19th, a sniper killed Corporal Davis while he was filling canteens at a creek. January 20th, another sniper killed 2 men from L Company during a patrol. January 21st, 3 more men died. One of them was shot through the neck from a tree the patrol had walked past twice. That night, the battalion commander summoned George. The Japanese snipers were killing his men faster than malaria. He needed someone who could shoot back. George explained his credentials: Illinois State Championship, expert marksman ratings. The commander gave him until morning. George spent that night checking his rifle for the 3rd time. The Winchester had been packed in cosmoline for the ocean voyage. He cleaned every component again, checked the scope mounts, loaded 5 rounds of .3006 hunting ammunition he'd packed back in Tennessee. At dawn on January 22nd, George moved into position in that captured bunker overlooking the coconut groves. He'd brought no spotter, no radio man, just his rifle, a canteen, and 60 rounds of ammunition in stripper clips. The Lyman Alaskan scope offered 2.5 power magnification, not much by today's standards, but enough to see movement in branches the naked eye would miss. The jungle was never silent. Birds, insects, distant artillery. George had learned to filter out the noise and focus on movement. He glassed the trees slowly, left to right, top to bottom. At 9:17 in the morning, he saw it. A branch moved with no wind, just a small shift. 87 feet up in a banyan tree, 240 yards away. George watched. The branch moved again. Then he saw the shape. A man in dark clothing positioned in a fork where 3 branches met. The Japanese sniper was facing east, watching the trail where American soldiers had been moving supplies. George adjusted a scope. 2 clicks right for wind. He controlled his breathing the way he'd done thousands of times on ranges back home. The Winchester's trigger broke clean at 3.5 pounds. He'd spent hours adjusting it at Camp Perry before the war. Now he'd find out if a civilian target rifle could kill a man trained to kill him first. George squeezed the trigger. The Winchester kicked into his shoulder. The crack echoed through the jungle. 240 yards away, the Japanese sniper jerked and fell. He dropped through the branches, his body tumbling 90 feet before hitting the ground near the base of the banyan tree. George worked the bolt. The empty cartridge ejected with that distinctive brass ring. He chambered another round and kept his scope on the tree, waiting. Japanese snipers worked in pairs, 1 shooter, 1 spotter. If George had just killed the shooter, the spotter was somewhere close. George scanned the surrounding banyans methodically. The scope's limited magnification forced him to search slowly. At 9:43, he found the second sniper in a different tree, 60 yards north of the first. This one was lower, maybe 50 feet up, and he was moving down the trunk. He'd heard the shot and knew his position was compromised. George aimed, led the movement, and fired. The second sniper fell backwards off the tree. His rifle clattered through the branches ahead of him. Both rifle and body hit the jungle floor within seconds of each other. 2 shots, 2 kills. George reloaded from a stripper clip. His hands were steady. This was no different than shooting at Camp Perry, except here the targets shot back. At 11:21, that reality caught up with him. A Japanese bullet struck the sandbag 6 inches from his head. The impact sprayed dirt into his face. George rolled left and pressed himself against the bunker wall. The shot had come from the southwest, a different direction than the first 2 snipers. George waited 3 full minutes before moving. Basic sniper doctrine says you shoot and relocate, but in jungle this dense, relocation options are limited. George inched back to his firing position and glassed the trees to the southwest. He found the shooter at 11:38. Third tree from the left in a cluster of 5 banyans, 73 feet up. The Japanese sniper had repositioned to a different branch, but remained in the same tree. A mistake. George put the crosshairs around the dark shape and fired. The third sniper fell without making a sound. By noon, George had killed 5 Japanese snipers. Word spread through the battalion fast. Men who'd mocked his mail-order rifle now asked if they could watch him work. George refused every request. Spectators drew attention. Attention drew fire. The Japanese adapted after the 5th kill. They stopped moving during daylight. George spent the entire afternoon glassing trees and seeing nothing. At 1600 hours, he returned to battalion headquarters. Captain Morris was waiting, and the mockery was gone from his voice. He wanted George back in position at dawn. January 23rd began with heavy tropical rain that turned the jungle floor into mud and made trees invisible beyond 100 yards. George sat in his bunker and waited. The rain stopped at 8:15. By 8:45, enough visibility had returned for work. George spotted his first sniper of the day at 9:12. The Japanese soldier had climbed into position during the rain. Smart move. The sound of rain masks movement. This sniper had chosen a tree 290 yards out, longer range than yesterday. Also smart. They were learning his capabilities. George compensated for distance and fired. The sniper fell. That 6th kill brought a response George hadn't anticipated. At 9:57, Japanese mortars began hitting the area around his bunker. They triangulated his position based on muzzle flash or sound. The first rounds landed 40 yards short. The second salvo landed 20 yards short. George didn't wait for the third. He grabbed his rifle and ran, sprinting north along the tree line before diving into a shell crater. The third salvo obliterated the bunker he'd occupied moments before. George relocated to a fallen tree 120 yards north of the destroyed position. The tree provided cover and a clear view of the groves. The Japanese sent more snipers that afternoon, and now they were hunting him as much as he was hunting them. The dynamic had shifted. This wasn't target shooting anymore. This was a duel. At 2:23 in the afternoon, George killed his 7th sniper. At 3:41, he killed his 8th. This one had climbed high, 94 feet up. Excellent concealment. But height creates a silhouette against the sky when the sun angle changes. At 1700 hours, Captain Morris sent a runner to bring George back. He'd been in position for 9 hours. Morris wanted numbers. George reported 8 confirmed kills over 2 days, 12 rounds fired, 8 hits, 4 misses. Morris assigned him to continue sniper operations, starting at dawn on January 24th. That night, George cleaned his Winchester and did the math. 11 Japanese snipers had been operating in the Point Cruz groves. 8 were now dead. 3 remained, and those 3 would be the best, the ones who'd survived the longest. And now they knew exactly what George looked like and exactly what rifle he carried. George loaded 5 fresh rounds and tried to sleep. At 3 in the morning, he gave up and sat in his tent with the rifle across his lap. The rain started again at 4:15. By 5:30, it was heavy enough that dawn operations would be delayed. George used that time to move to a new position, not the bunker, not the fallen tree, somewhere the Japanese wouldn't expect. He chose a cluster of large rocks the Marines had used as a machine gun nest back in December. The position offered good cover and overlapping fields of fire into the groves. At 7:43, the rain slowed to a drizzle. George began glassing trees. At 8:17 on January 24th, he found sniper number 9. The Japanese soldier was positioned in a palm tree, 190 yards out, only 40 feet up. Unusual. Most snipers climbed high for better sight lines. This one had chosen concealment over elevation. The palm fronds created a natural hide invisible from ground level. But George was elevated on the rocks, and the angle gave him a view down into the fronds. He could see the dark shape of the sniper's shoulders and head. George aimed, controlled his breathing, and began to squeeze the trigger. Then he stopped. Something felt wrong. The position was too obvious, too easy. George had been hunting snipers for 3 days. He'd killed 8 men. The remaining 3 wouldn't make elementary mistakes. They wouldn't position themselves where an elevated shooter could spot them unless it was bait. George lowered his rifle and scanned the surrounding trees. If the sniper in the palm was bait, the real shooter would be positioned to cover him, watching for anyone who took the shot, waiting for muzzle flash. George glassed the trees methodically, left to right, top to bottom. Every tree within 300 yards of that palm. It took 11 minutes. At 8:28, he found the real threat. A banyan tree 80 yards northwest of the palm, 91 feet up. The Japanese sniper had positioned himself in a perfect hide. Branches and vines concealed him from 3 sides. He had a clear line of sight to George's previous position at the fallen tree. He was waiting for George to appear there or to take a shot at the bait in the palm tree. George had 2 problems. First, the real sniper was watching the wrong location. If George fired at him now, the sound would reveal George's actual position, and the sniper would relocate before George could work the bolt and chamber another round. Second, if George did nothing, the sniper would eventually realize George wasn't at the fallen tree and begin searching for him. George decided to use their trap against them. He aimed at the decoy sniper in the palm tree, adjusted for wind, and fired. The decoy jerked and fell from the palm. George immediately swung his rifle toward the banyan tree 91 feet up. The real sniper would react to the shot. He'd turn toward the sound. That turn would create movement. George saw it, a slight shift as the sniper repositioned to face George's location. George put the crosshairs on the dark shape and fired before the sniper could fully turn. The real sniper fell. His rifle tumbled after him. 2 shots, 2 kills. But George had revealed his position to anyone else watching. He grabbed his rifle and ammunition and ran, moving east along the rock line before dropping into a drainage ditch 40 yards away. He pressed himself into the mud and waited. At 8:34, Japanese machine gun fire raked the rocks where he'd been positioned 6 seconds earlier. The bullets kicked up dust and stone fragments for 17 seconds straight. When the firing stopped, George counted to 60 before moving. He relocated again, this time to a shell crater partially filled with rainwater 100 yards east. George settled into the crater with water up to his chest, rested the Winchester on the crater rim, and resumed glassing trees. 10 confirmed kills, 1 remaining. The 11th sniper would be the best, the smartest, the most experienced. He'd watched 10 of his comrades die over 3 days. He knew George's tactics, knew his rifle, knew his approximate location. And somewhere in those trees, he was watching, waiting, planning. George scanned the jungle through his scope. At 9:47, he realized his mistake. The 11th sniper wasn't in the trees, he was on the ground, and he was moving toward George's position. George caught the movement at the edge of his peripheral vision, 60 yards south, low to the ground, a shape moving through undergrowth parallel to the tree line. The Japanese sniper was using jungle floor vegetation for cover, ferns, vines, fallen branches. He was crawling toward George's last known position at the rocks. George remained motionless in the water-filled crater. The Winchester was already shouldered, breathing controlled, but the angle was wrong. The crater rim blocked his view of the approaching sniper. George would have to rise up to get a clear shot, and rising up would expose him. The Japanese sniper stopped moving at 9:52. He'd reached a position 40 yards from the rocks and was studying them, searching for any sign of his target. George waited. Patience is the primary skill of sniper work. The ability to remain still, to let time pass, to wait for the right moment rather than force a bad shot. At 9:58, the Japanese sniper began moving again, crawling forward. 35 yards from the rocks, 30 yards, 25. He was approaching from the south side, the side George had used when he evacuated under machine gun fire. George understood the tactic. The Japanese sniper had watched that machine gun attack. He knew George had moved east from the rocks. He was now working his way along the most likely escape route, hunting George the way George had been hunting him. At 10:03, the Japanese sniper reached the rocks. He moved into the old machine gun nest and took up a position facing east, toward the drainage ditch, toward the area where George should have been relocated. The sniper was now 38 yards from George's actual position in the water-filled crater. His back was exposed. George had a clear shot. Center mass, 38 yards. An easy shot even without a scope. But George hesitated. This sniper had survived 10 days of American operations in the Point Cruz groves. He'd outlived 10 other snipers who'd been killed because they made mistakes. This man wouldn't make mistakes. The position in the rocks was too exposed, too vulnerable. No experienced sniper would remain there for more than a few seconds. This had to be another decoy. George kept his scope on the sniper in the rocks, but expanded his awareness to the surrounding area. If this was bait, the real threat would be positioned to cover it, somewhere with line of sight to anyone who took the shot. At 10:06, George found it. A second Japanese soldier, 70 yards northwest of the rocks, behind a fallen tree trunk. This soldier wasn't moving, wasn't repositioning, just watching, waiting. His rifle was aimed toward the drainage ditch where George should have been hiding. 2 men, not 1. The 11th sniper had brought support, or perhaps these were the final 2 snipers, numbers 10 and 11, working together. George made his decision. He couldn't shoot both men before they reacted. The bolt-action Winchester required him to work the action between shots, giving them time to locate him and return fire. He needed a different approach. George slowly lowered himself deeper into the water until only his eyes and the top of his head remained above the surface. He kept the Winchester pointed skyward to keep water out of the barrel. Then he waited. At 10:13, the Japanese soldier in the rocks stood up. He'd spent 10 minutes watching the drainage ditch and seen nothing. He believed George had moved farther east. He turned and signaled to his partner behind the fallen tree. Both men began moving east, parallel to each other, 70 yards apart. They were executing a sweep, planning to flush George out or find his position. George remained in the water, motionless. The 2 Japanese soldiers moved past his crater. They were now between George and the tree line, their backs exposed. George rose from the water slowly, silently. Water dripped from the barrel, from his uniform, from his face. He brought the Winchester to his shoulder and aimed at the closer soldier, the one who'd been in the rocks, now 42 yards away. He fired. The soldier dropped. George worked the bolt, chambered another round, swung the rifle toward the second soldier behind the fallen tree. The man was turning, raising his rifle. George fired first. The second soldier fell. 11 shots fired over 3 days. 11 Japanese snipers dead. George had cleared the Point Cruz groves of the threat that had killed 14 Americans in 72 hours. But as George climbed out of the crater to retrieve his spent cartridges, he heard something that made him freeze. Voices. Japanese voices coming from the tree line. Multiple men moving toward the fallen soldiers. George had killed the snipers, but the snipers hadn't been working alone. George dropped back into the crater. The water was cold, muddy. He submerged until only his eyes remained above the surface, holding the Winchester vertically to keep the barrel clear. The Japanese voices grew louder. At least 6 men, maybe more, moving toward the 2 dead snipers. George could hear branches breaking, equipment rattling. These weren't snipers, infantry, a patrol or recovery team sent to collect the bodies. The voices stopped at the location of the first body, 42 yards from his crater, close enough that George could hear them clearly, even without understanding the words. Then the voices moved to the second body, More conversation, urgent tones. At 10:28, the voices began moving again, but not back toward the tree line, toward George's crater. They'd found his tracks, boot prints in the mud leading from the rocks to the crater. George had been careful about noise and movement. He hadn't been careful about tracks. George had 5 rounds in the Winchester. 6 Japanese soldiers at minimum. Poor odds for a bolt-action rifle. The voices grew closer. 30 yards, 25 yards, 20. At 10:31, a Japanese soldier appeared at the crater rim looking down directly at George. Their eyes met. George fired from the water. The soldier fell backward. George worked the bolt while still submerged, chambered another round, rose up. 2 more soldiers were at the crater rim. George fired, worked the bolt, fired again. Both soldiers dropped. 3 rounds left. George could hear shouting, more soldiers moving toward him. He climbed out of the crater on the north side, away from the approaching voices, and ran 20 yards before dropping behind a fallen tree. Japanese rifle fire cracked through the jungle. Bullets struck the ground around the crater, around the fallen tree. The soldiers were firing at movement, at sound, not at confirmed targets. George stayed low and glassed the area through his scope. He saw movement. 2 soldiers advancing toward the crater, 50 yards out. George aimed at the lead soldier and fired. The soldier dropped. The second soldier dove for cover. 2 rounds left. George heard more voices behind him. The Japanese were flanking, one group approaching from the south, another from the east. George was about to be surrounded. He made his decision. He couldn't win a firefight with a bolt-action rifle against multiple soldiers with semi-automatic weapons. He needed to break contact and move back toward American lines. George grabbed his rifle and ran north, sprinting through jungle undergrowth. Vines caught his boots. Branches whipped his face. Japanese rifle fire followed him. Bullets snapped past, struck trees, kicked up dirt. George ran for 90 seconds before diving into another shell crater. This one was dry. He pressed himself against the crater wall and listened. The Japanese voices were distant now. They hadn't pursued. They were regrouping around their dead. George checked his rifle. Mud on the stock. Water still dripping from the barrel. He had 2 rounds left and no stripper clips. The clips were in his pack, and the pack was somewhere near that water-filled crater. At 10:47, George began moving again. Not running, walking, staying low, using terrain for cover. He moved northeast toward American lines. At 11:13, George reached the American perimeter. A Marine sentry challenged him. George identified himself. The sentry led him through. George walked to battalion headquarters and reported to Captain Morris. Morris wanted a full debrief. George provided it. 11 Japanese snipers killed over 4 days. 12 rounds fired against the snipers, 11 hits. Then a firefight with infantry. 3 more kills, 5 rounds total in that engagement. Morris asked about ammunition status. George was down to 2 rounds. Morris asked about the rifle. George said it was functional but needed cleaning. Mud in the action, water in the barrel. Morris told George to clean his rifle and rest. No operations tomorrow. The battalion was moving east. The Point Cruz groves were no longer a priority. The Japanese were evacuating Guadalcanal.
We stop here today, and we continue in the next part.